This is the companion methods demo video for the methods lecture. We're going to get some hands-on practice working with methods. So make sure that you do download the methods.cs file off of Blackboard and bring it into an open Unity scene. I've already done that. You can see the methods script here, and I did attach it to an empty game object that I renamed methods so that we can kind of jump in and get started. So if we take a look, we have 4 things we're going to accomplish today, and this should give us a lot of good practice creating our own methods. So the first one, it says for us to create a void method named printMyName, no parameters. When called, it should print your name to the console. Call this method in start. So it is a void method, which means we're not returning anything. No parameters means we don't need to put anything in the parentheses. So this is going to be one of the most basic sorts of methods that we can write. So I'm going to find a spot down here. I'm going to make sure to not go outside of this curly brace since this is part of this methods class. And if we put it down here by accident, it won't run correctly because it won't be a part of our script. So I'm going to make a space. Since we don't need to see this method in the Unity editor, we're not calling it from any kind of object in Unity. We don't need to look at it in Unity. Let's just go ahead and make sure that this is a private method. We're going to write void because we're not returning anything, and the name of the method is printMyName. And we do use Pascal case to name our methods. So P is going to be capitalized. So print. Methods can't have a space, so we're just going to start with my, capital M, Y, and then name again is capitalized, no space. So printMyName. We then add our parentheses, and since there's no parameters, we can kind of keep going. We then hit enter, and then we do our curly braces. And Visual Studio should autocomplete when you create the open one. It should automatically create a closed one for you. And I'm going to space this down so that we have a nice look to this. We do need to kind of keep track of these. We can see that Visual Studio gives us a dotted line showing us that anything in this dotted line will be associated with this method. Print into the console is very easy in Unity. We just do debug.log. And then inside the parentheses, we tell it what we want to print. We want to print our name. So I'm going to go and do my double quotes and give it my name. And then we end with a semicolon. And that's it for this method. Since we're not returning anything, we don't have to worry about anything else down here. We can just go ahead and call it. Remember that methods need to be called somewhere else in code or triggered through an event. So we're not really up to the point of creating our own events in the Unity editor. So instead we have to rely on the start and update, since these do get automatically triggered by the Unity engine when we run it. Start will run when we click the start button in the editor, and update runs once per frame as it, after we hit play. So we're going to just call it in start because we just want our name printed once. So all we have to do that is just write the name of our method. So it's printMyName. And notice that it does allow an autocomplete since it understands what, it recognizes this as a method. We could just select this out of here. And the last important thing, notice we are getting an error. We do need to close this off with parentheses and add our semicolon. Remember, we have to end all of our statements with a semicolon. So notice also if we click on here, the nice thing Visual Studio does is it does highlight what method you're calling. Like it recognizes that, so you really know that you are calling the correct one because it highlights it. So let's save it. I'm going to hit Control S to save, run over to Unity real quick, and get my console ready and hit play. and I get my name printed. So the nice thing about methods is now that we know that this is working, if I did need to print my name multiple times or call it in multiple places, like maybe I needed it in start and update and maybe some other methods, all I need to do is write print my name. I don't have to fiddle around with figuring out the code to do this. It's good to go. We can do this as many times as we wanted, and I could get my name printed out as many times as I wanted. I know it seems kind of silly for one line of code, but we will eventually have methods that are multiple lines of code, and it would be a pain to have to recode that every single time that we wanted to run those. So that's it for number 1, very simple. And number 2 kind of moves on with, adding some complexity to this to kind of practice a little bit more, where we're going to create a void method. So again, we're not returning anything yet, called print any name. And this has one string parameter named name. And when we call it, it should print out the name parameter to the console. So this one is hard-coded in the name that we assign it. Print any name will allow us to print anybody's name to the console. We're just going to add that name in our parentheses so that it can be called. And we can print that. So let's do that down here. Again, let's make sure we're not going outside that curly brace, or else we're going to have issues. We'll give it a little bit of space. We're going to just do private again. You're going to find that a lot of your methods just end up being private. You should just kind of automatically put it as private unless you know explicitly that you're going to be calling that in the Unity editor or some other script. Void, because we're not returning anything. And let's give it our name, print any name. Parentheses, and then go to the next line and do our curly braces. Oh, so let's go in now that we got this kind of set up and put our parameter in here. Remember, we have one string parameter that we're going to call name. So let's kind of put that in here. So when we do a parameter, the first thing we do is we tell it what data type. And we are going to do a string, so we just type string. And then we have to give it a name because it's basically a variable. Like we can use this just as a local variable to here instead of our code. So similar to defining a variable is we give it the data type and a name. So we're just going to call this one name. So now we can use name down here however we want. And it's going to be very simple, kind of like print my name. All we want to do is print whatever we have in here to the console. So we're going to just do debug.log. And rather than, the hard-coded this, we're just going to say name. And we're going to end in a semicolon. So all we need to do now is call print any name in our start, because remember, we have to call our methods in order for them to run. So we'll just keep this up here as print my name, and then we'll call print any name. Start typing it. Notice it is an option to autocomplete now. We have to put the parentheses and semicolon. We are getting an error message because we did forget to do something. So let's hover over that error and see what it says. It says there is no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter name of our method. That's because since we are asking for a string, we have to give it a string. Otherwise, we're going to error with that. So let's do that. Let's give this a string to print. We'll do Bob. Will work. Let's save it and test it. Let's hit run. So I have my name and Bob gets printed. So the real nice thing about this now is we could print whatever we wanted. You know, we're not stuck with just our name. We could call print any name and give it another name, and we could just kind of keep going with this. Let's do a real quick test and see what happens if we try to send we're going to send a parameter. I'm sorry, we're going to send we're going to put in our argument for our parameter, but we're going to make a mistake and accidentally put in a number instead. Let's see what happens. So I do 4. Notice this throws an error too, and we can hover over it and it'll tell us what the issue is. And it says it cannot convert from int to string. So it is expecting a string. We need to give it a string. So if you see errors like this, most likely, it's thankfully pretty obvious that it's telling us we're not sending the correct data type with it. What about if we try to send it 2 strings? What happens? What if we tried to send it Bob and Sue at the same time? Notice we're getting a different type of error, and it just says no overloads for method print any name takes 2 arguments. So we can't send more than 1 since we only ask for 1. And if you ever see that no overload for method, it just means that you are trying to send it more arguments than the parameters you have listed down here. So just be aware of the possible errors for this and how to fix them. So that's it for this question. We got number 2 done. Let's move on to number 3. Create a method that returns a string named format name. 2 string parameters named first and last. When called, it should take the 2 string parameters and format them into 1 string with a space between the 2. So example, if you send it first last, we see the first name, there's a space, and then your last name. The formatted string should be returned. Call the function start first by having a string variable store the return information and print it to the console, and then by directly printing the return information to the console. So we're going to get a little bit of practice not only creating a method that has parameters, but we're also going to start practicing a little bit with methods that return a value. So let's go find a space. We'll put that down here. And I'll go down, and again, private, there's no reason to make it public. And since we're returning a string, we don't put void, because void means that we are not returning something. So since we're returning a string, we just do string. And then we name our method, which is going to be format name. And it needs two string parameters. So we're going to do string first, string second. And let's put that down there. So notice I am getting an error. And if we hover over that, because we didn't get errors, we set it up correctly. Why is it having an error with this method? So let's hover over it and see what happened. So it says our method, not all code paths return a value. So we don't have anything in here yet, but it is expecting us to return something. And we haven't set that up yet. So if you see this kind of error, don't worry. This error will be taken care of once we finish coding out our stuff. So it's okay to kind of ignore this for now, but once you feel that you're done with your value returning methods, if you still see that error, you need to take a closer look at your code. So let's format this. Let's make a string called toReturn, and we'll use this to format our string nicely. So to do that, we'll set that equal to our first name plus a little space plus second. So it'll take whatever is in first, put that into to return. It'll add a little space on the end of that. It'll take whatever's stored in second and put that on the end of that after the space. And that's it. That's all we had to do inside this method. The last step is to return that. And the way that we do that, we just write the word return and we give it the string to return. So this one's pretty easy. It's just our to return string with our semicolon at the end. And that's it. A very basic method, but a very good example of working with a return on there. So let's go up and call it. The directions first tell us to store the return in a string variable. So let's do that first, because if we're using methods that return things, we always need something on the other end of where we call it to catch it. If we just called format name and give it our two strings, we're not going to get an error because there's nothing really wrong with it. The issue though is when this gets called, it takes those two strings, it goes down here, it concatenates them with the space, it returns it, it spits it back out, and where does it go? It goes into nothing. So if we were to run this code and we could try it and see what happens, there's nothing wrong with that. We get our name, we get Bob and Sue, but we don't, one, we didn't print anything yet. But two, nothing, what catches it? Nothing. How do we call this? So how do we deal with Homer Simpson nicely formatted? The first way is just to have a variable catch it. So since this is returning a string, we can have a string variable to catch it. So we would just call our variable and set it equal to, and then call that method that returns a value. It does have to be the same data type, so since it returns a string, it does need to go into a string variable, and then we can just print whatever's stored in full name to the console. The other way that we can do this is, if we don't need to do anything with full name later on, like we're just printing it, we don't need to manipulate it, we don't need to store it, we just need it printed and nothing else, we can directly call format name inside of debug.log to print. So we can do debug.log, and inside of parentheses, we can call that method. We just type format name and give it our name to format. So we'll do Mickey Mouse. So Mickey Mouse. And what happens is the computer hits debug.log. So it says, okay, we're going to print something to the console. What are we going to print? Oh, we hit this method, format name. Let's send it Mickey Mouse. It'll come down here. It'll find this. It says, okay, first and second, that's Mickey Mouse. It'll format it with Mickey space mouse, return the string. It'll get spit back out, end up inside of here, and it will get printed to the console. So let's save this and let's check that we do get our Homer Simpson and our Mickey Mouse. So we see Homer Simpson and Mickey Mouse. So both ways are valid. It really just depends on what you need to do with this information. Again, since this is being stored in full name, we can manipulate this later on if we need to. So like we could do full name plus equals and add more to it if we needed to. But Mickey Mouse gets printed and that's lost forever into the ether. We can't access that with a variable some other way. So kind of think about what you need to do with your data when you are calling those methods that return a value. Okay, last one. Create a class scoped int variable named counter and set it to 0. Create a void method named display counter, no parameters. When called, it should print the current value of the counter to the console and then raise the value up by 1. Call this method an update. So basically what we're creating is a frame counter where it's going to print a number every frame that our game runs. So the reason we're doing a class scoped variable, actually we'll do an experiment of why it's class scoped versus local scoped, just to kind of help cement the idea of class versus local. So class scoped variable means we're going to put it up here before our methods, but inside this first curly brace. So it's just an int variable named counter, so int counter, and we're going to set that equal to 0. We'll make our new, we'll do it here. I'm just going to put it above, print my name. It doesn't matter the order that we do these in, but I don't want to keep scrolling all the way down and back up. So it's fine if it goes right here. What is it called? Display counter. Okay, private void. We're not returning anything. Display counter. We're not sending it anything since we are using that class level variable instead. All we need to do is we need to print what's currently being stored in the counter. So that's just debug.log counter. And then we're going to raise that counter by 1. So counter plus plus. Next, let's just call display counter in update. So we just do display counter, our parentheses, and our semicolon. So each frame update fires. So it hits here, it finds this. What happens? It prints what is in here, so it'll be 0 for the first time. It'll then raise this by 1. So it will go to 1. Next frame, finds it again, prints out 1, raises it to 2, etc., etc., etc. So let's try this out. Let's see what happens. Let's watch what happens back in Unity. We can see it going real quick since it is 30 to 60 times a second. Do I have my stats up? So I'm actually getting a crazy amount of frames per second since there's not much going on in my game. But you can see it constantly running, constantly going up. So why did we make a class scoped up here? Why didn't we just make a local one where we just do this? So I'm going to actually alter this code. You don't need to do this part if you don't want to. You can just kind of watch. Let me comment out these lines of code, and I'm going to put new code in here to kind of show you why we needed to work with this. So what if we had just done, and we made a new counter. I'll call this one local counter. Set it equal to 0. And let's run it. We'll do debug.log local counter. And then we'll raise it by 1. Local counter plus plus. So let's run this and see what happens. And that's fine. It's just, yellow's fine. We're concerned about red. So we run this and we just get a bunch of zeros. We're not getting our counter anymore. Why is that? It's because of the way that this runs. So update again runs every frame. We go to display counter. What happens? We initialize and create this variable called local counter and set it to 0. We then print it, and then we then raise it, and then our method is done. This gets, anything done in here is gone. It updates again. It calls display counter. What's the first thing it does? It creates that variable again, sets it to 0, and prints 0, raises it by 1, but then we hit the end of the method and this all disappears. Again, 0, print 0, and it disappears. So every time, we call this method, anything that's in there is gone. So we can't create this locally. We keep it up here as a class level 1. So it's scoped to the whole class. So as we write it, it kind of like keeps that. So we don't get it destroyed every single time our display counter ends. So that won't work that way. The other way I kind of want to show, I won't actually do it, but we can discuss it. What about making a counter in here? And then just setting it where we send it, because hey, we can write back to it. Like we can just say local counter is equal to display counter, and we send local counter there, and we raise it by 1, and we return it back into here. Like, would that work? No, that wouldn't work, because again, update. Once we're done with the update, it's done. It's like it disappears, and then next frame, it's like it's calling a brand new update. So it would start back here with 0, and we would still have that same cycle over and over again. So if there's information that you kind of need to keep outside of things like update or start, that needs to kind of be initialized, and it's data that's going to be constantly written to and updated and needs to be looked at, it needs to be up here as a class scoped variable so that it kind of gets saved and remains while the script is running. So local variables work for here because we just need it one and done. We don't need to deal with full name after we print it, so we can just create our variable here. Counter needs to run, outside, independent of these, because once they're destroyed, that number would disappear. So if you end up working with, numbers or anything, and it feels like something's not updating, one of the things you should check is to see if your variables need to be class level, and maybe you accidentally made them local, and that information is just kind of constantly rewriting itself or not saving out to go, appropriately. All right, that's it for this demo. Hopefully you found this useful. You're going to be working with methods a lot. Again, methods are the bones of your program. We're getting work done. We're displaying our counter. We're printing names. We're doing lots of action-y things. So kind of keep that in mind. And the more that you work with methods, the more you kind of get a sense of, should it be a return one? Should it take parameters? Should I work with class variables instead? So I will see you in the next lesson, and have a good rest of your day.